Theseus was a mythical king who supposedly founded Athens, and from his arrival stems the old philosophical thought puzzle about his grand old ship. According to Plutarch, the ship returned from Crete and was preserved lovingly by the Athenians through the passage of hundreds of years, with parts that fell into decay gradually replaced. This leads to the question of identity that was postulated by the likes of Plato and Heraclitus. If the Athenians continued to replace the old parts, would the ship still be the same one? If we apply the same thought to computing, I've had the same desktop computer for the last decade, but as time has passed, bits and pieces have changed. At what point do I consider it a new machine? When the motherboard has been replaced, when the processor has changed? Or is it still the same machine irrespective of how much I've changed it by virtue of me identifying it as that machine? In the gaming world, there's no better example of this thought puzzle than the progressive alteration of Doom. The original release of Doom was a single episode shareware title on an FTP server. Now this is clearly Doom, but it's not the Doom that most people would be playing these days. A mail order version with 2 new episodes superseded it shortly afterward, and that's where the differences start to creep in. Episode 1 was mostly designed by John Romero, but he's absent in both episodes 2 and 3. It's also not the version that most people ended up playing either, as a commercial release of Doom appeared in 1995 with a 4th episode, called The Ultimate Doom. This was the one that turned up on digital distribution sites too. And despite their differences in version number and subtle function, I think most people would agree that all these games are Doom. They were developed by id Software in the 90s and all operated on the same engine, with modifications here and there. But much like the 2nd and 3rd episode, Thy Flesh Consumed featured designers who weren't present during the original shareware release of Doom. After the initial patching from 1.0 through to 1.9 and then Ultimate, this is the second plank replaced in our doomed ship, with Sandy Peterson and Tom Hall brought on board, and Dr. Sleep and Tim Willits coming in to contribute for the 4th episode. To some people, so long as the engine is the same, it's all Doom, but id Software licensed that engine out to Raven for Heretic, and even though it bears remarkable similarities, it's not Doom. But all the commercial add-ons to Doom and its sequel quite clearly are Doom. The weapons and monsters and textures are the same as stock Doom. The only difference are the levels, except some commercial modifications of Doom have different monsters and textures. Axe isn't Doom, but what about the likes of Perdition's Gate and Hell to Pay? The textures in Perdition's Gate are different and the levels are different, but the monsters and weapons and gameplay are identical. Is it Doom? If it is, then is Hell to Pay? It uses a different monster sound and texture. At what point does it become for Doom rather than being Doom outright? Perhaps it's a semantic thing, or a developer thing. Are they not Doom because they're not called Doom? Are they not Doom because they're not released by id? By 1997, the classic Doom releases were complete, and nobody was looking to license the id Tech 1 engine, so it's safe to draw a line under it at that point, right? No Rest for the Living was an officially licensed expansion pack for Doom 2, and came with the Xbox Live Arcade version of the game. It was developed by Nerve Software, and further pushed the idea that Doom could be created by people who had nothing to do with the original release 17 years after the fact. Is that Doom? Sure is. Or is it? Lastly, to add to the conundrum is John Romero's return to the scene with his modified levels for Doom, and Sigil, which Wikipedia calls the unofficial 5th episode of Doom. Except there's no new graphics or sounds or enemies, it's made by the original designer, and it uses the exact same engine. So why unofficial? Because id didn't publish it? Id were bought out by Bethesda at this point, so are they even id anymore? Can we use that as a measuring stick when the likes of Romero and Carmack don't even work there? Plus, Sigil itself ended up released by Bethesda the following year as part of Doom. So whose blessing does it need in order to become the official 5th episode? It's already featured in the release timeline on Wikipedia's Doom franchise page. So it's undoubtedly Doom, right? But enough speculation about levels and designers. The other aspect of Doom worthy of discussion is that it has been ported to more systems than any other FPS. And all these releases are called Doom, right? Whether it's for a calculator or a console, you're playing Doom, even if none of the code is the same. But if it comes down to code for you, then Doom was open sourced. And with that comes the ability to modify, and on top of being one of the most ported games of all time, Doom is also one of the most modded. Engine replacements, music replacements, level replacements, texture replacements, and gameplay alterations abound. id Software themselves integrated the Doom engine into their id Tech 4 framework for the BFG edition of Doom 3 and Doom Classic for consoles. There's even a 2020 version of Doom released by Bethesda that's entirely official, as they're the rights holder, that replaces the id Tech 4 with Unity, with a credit list of people that most definitely weren't involved in the original creation of Doom. And then we take it one step further and get to the real crux of the matter. The Free Doom project is a complete free content game based on the Doom engine. It can run on the Doom engine, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So if you're playing 3 Doom on GZ Doom, the argument could be made that you're not playing any sort of Doom at all. The levels are changed, the graphics and sound are different, the gameplay's altered, you're not even the same protagonist, but it's called Doom. GZ Doom and the various other ports that Free Doom can operate on were created using the source code for Doom. Much like how the rebuilt ship of Theseus retained the shape of the original ship, or maybe retained a plank or two here and there. We don't know for sure. Is that the final cause of the transformation from Doom to not Doom in the minds of people then? When no trace of John Carmack's original code or John Romero's design remains? That's the amusing thing about modern games. There's elements of old code buried deep within even the most modern of titles at times, and in some cases not so deep. Original Doom graphics by Adrian Carmack can be found in both of Bethesda's recent Doom games, and bits of code developed decades in the past can still be seen operating in their more modern descendants, even if it's just a line or two that remain. Ultimately, there's no answer what constitutes Doom or doesn't. The answer will vary from person to person. But it's an interesting thought experiment, and one that future developers should definitely consider each time they attempt to remaster or resurrect old titles. And if you enjoyed this amateur philosophy video talking about Doom, I have a whole pile of retro videos on the channel, feel free to take a look. And if you like it, you can always subscribe. Until next time.